Before we begin, there are a few things I need to make sure you understand. You see, no one can change what happened last year. The past is beyond our control. You have to accept this in order to move forward.
Until Dawn put me into an interesting state. I super liked it, but I wasn't entirely sure why. Strictly speaking, Until Dawn doesn't actually bring that much new to the table. It's got dialogue and decision-driven gameplay like Telltale games, quick-time events like literally every other game and its dog, and horror tropes from pretty much any scary movie ever made. But what sets it apart is what it does with each one of these and how it handles them so damn well. But how does it do it? Let's find out. The game begins a year before it actually begins. We meet a gang of teenage buttheads who are pulling a prank on a girl that causes her and her sister to run into a snowstorm and die horribly. This sets up for events that are going to take place later in the game, but it also tells the player exactly what this is going to be. A struggle for survival against nature, murder and monsters, full of gore and danger, all covered up by a thin veneer of sexy teenage drama.
And then we can get warm?
We can get very warm.
The game proper takes place a year later, as the same teenagers decide that the best way to remember their friends who died on a deadly mountain far from civilization and anyone who could possibly help them, is to go back up on a deadly mountain far from civilization and anyone who could possibly help them. At least they're sticking to what they know. The inclusion of the prologue is critical because of this guy. Without the prologue, it would be hard for the start of the game to build tension. Horror takes time to build up, and if the first hour was just teenage jerks jerking each other, that could get pretty dull. However, the inclusion of the prologue means that we know that there's something deadly on the mountain, and with this, we see that it knows they're here. They don't know that, but we do, which means that every little thing they do has the player saying, "No, there's a killer behind you." This background menace is what makes the intro work, because without it, it really is just teenage drama. Each of the characters we saw before gets an actual introduction, as well as a list of their 3 key traits, which may or may not always be accurate. And you quickly get an idea of what cliché every character represents.
Whoa! Hi, Chris. Very funny.
Oh, how'd you know it was me?
The use of cliché here actually works pretty well. Since it's dominantly a horror game, they have limited time to establish the characters because they have to build up the tension in the atmosphere for the horror. By presenting the characters as clichés at the start, it allows the player to quickly recognize them and identify with them, as a form of narrative shorthand. But at the start, introducing all the characters as clichés is fine for the purpose of getting the player to understand who everyone is. Throughout the game, they grow more nuanced through story events, play decisions, and through the other characters. The interactions between the characters are pretty convincing, and make you feel that this is a group of friends with quite a lot of baggage behind them. Relationships have already formed and crumbled, and may well do so again before the trip is over.
Mike and Em split. We're together.
Whoa, drama.
Not really. Pretty clear-cut, actually. Em's out, I'm in.
The dialogue can be pretty campy, and has a share of cringe-worthy lines.
Very friendly.
Unfollow.
But for the most part, it feels natural and flows well, which is thanks in no small part to the quality of the acting. I have to make mention of the graphical fidelity in Until Dawn. Not only because the game's graphical achievements are worth a healthy dose of praise, but because here, they directly impact the delivery of the story. Until Dawn shows us how close we are to getting out of the uncanny valley. The characters are easily identified as their real-world counterparts, but it's the facial expressions that really push over the edge. The fact that I can legitimately talk about the acting here speaks volumes about what they've achieved. So, the acting. The actors do a good job of both the physical and voice acting, and their expressions are pretty well translated to the in-game models. This, coupled with the fluidity and natural appearance of most of the animations, well, most of the animations, help us to identify with the characters, and the fact that the player is put in control of every one of them removes one of the biggest barriers that would have existed had it been a movie instead. As you get to know them, you get invested in these characters and want to see them live or die. In a story like this, which is heavily focused on the characters themselves, being able to connect with the characters to this level does wonders for helping the player connect with the story overall. Which is great, because it means that the game can then really start to mess with you. Part of horror is about disempowerment, instilling a feeling of helplessness and dread. Until Dawn goes about doing so in a bunch of ways, some of which are pretty clever. First, it gives your actions permanence, much like the Banner Saga. There are no take-backsies. Furthermore, if you get someone killed, the game goes on without them, which maintains the player's immersion in the story. In many horror games, if you die, the game simply resets your progress, so you have to do that bit again, which often leads to frustration rather than fear as you keep getting torn apart by the same damn tentacle monster. In Until Dawn, if someone dies, they stay dead, and you keep going with whoever's left. This is the effect of increasing the fear rather than reducing it, as if one of the kids meets a particularly grisly end, and they will, you really don't want that happening to anyone else. Well, maybe one or two of them. And will be more on edge trying to avoid it. Next is the cinematography. Often, the scene will be constructed to build unease, including plenty of horror tropes like dark corners, dusty ruins and such, and the character will be placed to give the impression of the characters being watched, sometimes more obviously than others. But the lighting is the real kicker. Until Dawn knows that if they just make everything dark as buggery, the player will get frustrated not being able to see anything. Instead, it always gives you a pathetic little light source you can control, like a phone light or a flashlight. It gives you a small amount of power, a tiny light to move around and see by, which serves to reinforce exactly how weak you are against a massive surrounding darkness. It connects you to the characters by putting you in exactly the same situation as them, feebly peering into the shadows. Finally, the piece that ties it all together is the inclusion of the totems. These little doohickeys give you a glimpse of future events, often providing warnings or guidance. The trick with these is that they have to be useful enough to search for, but not so useful that they totally give away what's going to happen. They provide you with a tiny nugget of information, and you're generally feeling so powerless that you naturally want to arm yourself with as many of these as you can. Forcing the player to poke around spooky areas for important items is something that horror games, especially survival horror, have done for a long time, but Until Dawn stands out in the quality of its execution. It puts you in a big, dark, scary world, gives you the world's crappiest flashlight, and then you start exploring every dark corner, every nook and cranny of your own volition, searching for totems and clues. Now, flashlights are not exactly new to horror games, but it's usually delivered from a first-person or over-the-shoulder perspective. This third-person camera takes the flashlight from simply being your field of vision and turns it into a magnifying glass that you as the player are poring over the world with. It enhances the feeling of exploration by scanning over these large scenes rather than being in a fixed perspective. This emphasis on exploration also puts you in a position where you're justifying your own terrible horror movie choices. Sure, you probably shouldn't be opening all these morgue slabs, but what if there's a clue in there? You can probably split from the group for just a second, there could be totems. It gives you just enough rope to hang yourself with, and it does it really, really well. As I played for Until Dawn, the impression I got was that they had taken basically every horror trope ever, thrown them all in a big pot, and put it on a slow boil. You've got zombies, ghosts, slashers, clowns, saw traps, wild animals, dumb teenagers. The list is pretty comprehensive.
Hey! Yeah, pricks! That means you!
But what surprised me most was that from this giant soup of horror cliches, it manages to actually pull out a coherent plot. It even manages to split up the characters for fairly sensible reasons. Every time you're shouting at the screen for them to just lock themselves in a room somewhere, or they'll be shouting each other to just stay in the damn room. Someone will come up with a reason to jump back into the danger that you're forced to admit has a degree of merit. As the plot progresses, your choices begin to pay off, both positively and negatively. Most often, the main difference your choices actually make is providing a safety net should you screw up later on. Leaving a baseball bat in the basement will mean that you can hit someone with it later. Befriending a dog will result in backing you up. However, these choices usually only kick in if you've screwed up. If you nail all the QuickTime events and make all the correct choices, you can end up never actually needing these safety nets, and Chekhov's gun just sits on a table the whole game, which can feel pretty unsatisfying. And outside of these safety nets, not many of your choices actually have a huge impact on the direction of the story. The fact that the plot gets pretty convoluted and characters can be killed off for reals means that some of the characters get pretty badly sidelined. Some of them can get pushed out of the main plot altogether and have to pursue their own little mini arcs for a while, which is a nice way to close out their arc but doesn't really provide much to the overall plot. It's the price you pay for murdering your cast. The story needs to function with or without those characters. The game handles this by making the potentially dead characters either injured or burned out enough that they're happy to let the other characters take the lead for once. Also, they keep the time you spend as each character relatively even by having the death-prone characters take up most of the early game. The main characters of the second half of the game are simply removed from the plot until their part kicks in, either by stranding them on a mountain or just stick them in the bath for 5 hours. One thing that's easy to overlook in Until Dawn are the character statistics. Each character has bars measuring various personality traits as well as relationship status with the other characters. My immediate thought was, well, what's the point of this? Am I not in control of these people? Why should I care that a character's bravery is low when I can just force them to walk in the spooky corridor whenever I want to? And while this is true, it is a little more subtle than that. The actions you take while controlling each character influence their stats. If you make someone do something brave, their bravery will increase. If they leave their friends to die, their charity will decrease, and probably loyalty too, and relationship will probably suffer a lot amount too. But none of these stats actually matter while you're controlling the character, because after all, you are in complete control of their choices. The stats become relevant when you're not controlling that character. If you've had someone being a scaredy cat and just tank their bravery all game, they will be cowardly later on when faced with danger and you're not actively pushing them into it. Souring a relationship with someone means that they may not help you when you most need it. It's a subtle thing that can be hard to notice given the structure of the game, but the way it shapes the character interactions can be fascinating and chilling to behold. And if you think, well, no problem, I'll just be super nice and brave and clever when I'm controlling everyone, that may not actually be the correct play. Sometimes the gallant knight who goes charging to the aid of others will just get super murder-faced for their trouble. Sometimes it pays to be selfish. And sometimes dying isn't the worst thing that can happen to someone. Until Dawn tries to keep a lot of balls in the air, and for the most part, it succeeds. It maintains a gripping atmosphere and has an effective plot, and populates it with a suite of characters that do end up being quite sympathetic. It's pushed this brand of narrative and choice-driven gameplay into new territory, and has done so with brilliant execution. If you like Telltale games, horror games, David Cage games, or just slasher flicks, you might want to pick this one up.